So it's 1819, and Julia Ward is born. Her parents are Samuel Ward, a wealthy New York banker, and her mother is Julia Rush Cutler, an occasional poet. And Julia, little baby Julia, is the third of 6 children. And these folks in New York in 1819 are wealthy. They have a private library in their home, an art gallery, and Julia is brought up with the best education money can buy. She's speaking 6 or 7 languages by the time she's 10 years old. She's learned science and mathematics along with music and philosophy and literature. And her brother marries into the Astor family, so they only go up and up in New York society. But when Julia is 5, her mother dies, and so she and her siblings are left with their father, who is a very protective man, but also a very stern man. He is an Episcopal and he is a Calvinist. And for those who may not know what Calvinism is these days, it boils down to the idea that there are certain folks who are basically on a secret list kept by God, and those folks will be saved. And you can't know whether you're on that list or not, no matter how good of a life you live. You might just not end up making it to heaven, even if you're a perfect person. So you can imagine the anxiety that people live under when they're brought up in a very strict Calvinist tradition, as Julia was. But nonetheless, they were still very social, and she was able to get out and about in society, and she was vivacious and learned and interesting and great at carrying on conversations. Now, her father died in 1839 when she's just 20 years old, and at this point, the world starts to open up for her. Because she's been reading in this private library of theirs different things over the years that have tantalized her and intrigued her, but now she can actually really go study these things. And at this point in her life, she says, this is when she found Unitarianism, and she gets really excited because she gets to leave behind, as she calls it, the agony of Calvinism and find this new restorative way of understanding the world and God and herself. She starts correspondence with a friend named Mary Ward, no relation, in Boston. And these two are writing back and forth, and then Mary's telling her about all the things that Unitarians are doing in Boston. And finally, Julia decides, I am going to go to Boston, and I'm going to meet all these folks and see all this firsthand. And so she goes to Boston, and she hears a sermon by William Ellery Channing and gets to meet him. And then she's invited with Ralph Waldo Emerson to hear a lecture from him and have dinner with him. And then she goes out on the town, and she's escorted by none other than Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This is just your average trip to Boston, right? And she's just a little bit over 20 at this point. So she meets all these Unitarian luminaries of the time, and she's more excited than ever to delve into what they're doing and the way that they're understanding the world and our call as human beings of conscience to respond to what's happening. And while she's out with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, just name dropping a lot in this sermon this morning, she's out with him and she meets someone named Laura Bridgman. Does anybody know who Laura Bridgman is? So Laura Bridgman was someone who was, she had scarlet fever when she was, I think, 2 years old, and she lost her sight because of it and lost her hearing. But she went to a fledgling blind school where she was able to learn how to read and communicate, and she became the toast of society about 50 years before Helen Keller. So Julia meets Laura Bridgman, and they get along famously, and she meets Laura Bridgman's teacher. This is the man who's founded this blind institute, the Perkins School for the Blind, and his name is Samuel Gridley Howe. Now, Samuel's about 18 years older than her. He's stern, very serious, devout in terms of trying to make a difference in the world. He's started this institute. He's worked with Laura. He's worked with other people. And meanwhile, there's Julia, who's vivacious and auburn hair and great at carrying on a conversation. These two were complete opposites. And you know what happens when opposites meet? They attract. And that's what happened. And they both knew it was probably against their better judgment. But as things will happen, in 1843, these two married. The attraction was too strong. Now, he was worried. Samuel was worried. He thought, how could this vivacious New York socialite ever settle into this work that he was doing? And she was worried too. She thought, how do I keep a sense of who I am and also do what I feel like I'm expected to do in this role? So she moved from that lavish New York mansion into a few rooms at this blind school in Boston and tried her very best to do what she thought she was supposed to do. But she found herself sneaking off, especially on Sundays, for a full day of hanging out with Unitarians and hearing what they were doing. And she started to secretly write poetry in between having 6 children. And she wrote these poems, and she ended up having them published anonymously. And when her husband found out, he was really upset that she was writing and sharing it with the world. But critics who didn't know who she was saying, who is this woman that's giving a voice to women who feel trapped in this role of wife in our world today? So she was already making waves even before people knew that she was the woman behind that. As I said, they had 6 children, and the 6th child, when he was somewhere between 3 and 4 years old, we're not quite sure, died. And his loss was a great grief for both Julia and Samuel. At this point, their marriage was not doing so well. They even talked of divorce, but Samuel said he would take 2 of the kids with him if they divorced, and Julia would not give up her children, so she felt she had to stay in that situation. But she struggled because even the money that she inherited was controlled by her husband, and there was a lot of tension between them during those years. Now, also during those years, there was tension in the country. The division between the North and South was getting greater and greater, and Julia found herself working with people like William Lloyd Garrison, whose anti-slavery work was picking up its pace. All these Unitarians were involved with trying to end the lives of the enslaved situation that people were dealing with. And Julia found herself very much on board with that. And she was working with those people. And as the Civil War broke out in 1861, she and her husband were part of something called the Sanitary Commission. And this was an organization that helped Union soldiers. And so they went to Washington on a trip there at the beginning of the Civil War. They go on this trip, and they're there to see this procession of Union soldiers in a review, and they're all gathered around in their carriages and watching these troops, and there's a Confederate attack at that moment. And so everyone starts to flee, and they get in their carriage, and she's in the carriage with her current Unitarian minister, and they're driving away, and the Union troops are surrounding them, and as they move on, the troops start singing to buoy their spirits. And they start singing this terrible song called John Brown's Body. And the lyrics are something about John Brown's body moldering in the grave. And it's something they sing to buoy their spirits, and they're singing it. And eventually this Unitarian minister looks at Julia and says, you know, you're a poet. You could write better lyrics for this tune. So Irene's going to play for us just a little bit of this tune that was called John Brown's Body at the time. So is that sounding familiar, right? So Julia goes home that night, and she has said, no, I couldn't possibly write lyrics for this song. She goes home, and she puts the kids to bed. They're actually at a hotel. She puts the kids to bed, and in the middle of the night, she's awakened suddenly. She said this, awakened suddenly, and she looks for a candle, lights a candle, finds a stub of a pencil, tries not to wake the kids, and on a piece of paper, scrap paper, she writes out lyrics that will only end up being ever so slightly edited by her over the next couple of days. She writes the song that you know, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." Now, this is a woman who believed, you can tell in those lyrics, she believed in the cause of right and wrong. She believed in what the North was doing. She believed that that was the side of right. And that song was sold to the Atlantic for $5 and kind of undersold herself there with that, I think, because it took off in the North. It became the North's song for the Civil War. And she, as I said, believed in its message. But as the war continued, and as the war finally ended, she witnessed the devastation of war. She saw her friends' children not coming home from the war. She saw widows. She saw devastated families. She saw trauma. She saw a divided country trying to pull itself back together. And while she still believed in that song and she believed that the North had been on the side of right, she recognized it was all more complicated than she thought. Her husband was also being really annoying during this time, too. And so she found herself working with a group of women. And together, she was one of the founders of one of the major national suffrage movements here in the United States. And as she worked with these women, she started to have a realization. She said that she had realized in that moment of being with women, talking to them about the war, talking with them about society, that she had missed something. She wrote, "During the first 2/3 of my life, I looked to the masculine idea of character as the only true one. I sought its inspiration and referred my merits and demerits to its judicial verdict. The new domain now made clear to me was that of true womanhood. Woman no longer in her ancillary relation to her opposite, man, but in her direct relation to the divine plan and purpose as a free agent, fully sharing with man every human right and every human responsibility. This discovery was like the addition of a new continent to the map of the world, or of a new testament to the old ordinances." So there she is, working with these women in the aftermath of the Civil War, trying to advance society for women and for others. And what happens? In 1870, another war breaks out, the Franco-Prussian War. And this is a war that she feels like could have been settled with just a little diplomacy instead of bloodshed. And she's angry at this point. She's no longer silenced by her husband, by her father. She is speaking with a loud voice in the center of the social sphere. And she has something to say. And Natasha is going to come forward and share in full with us the declaration for Mother's Day that Julia Ward Howe made in 1870.
Words by Julia Ward Howe. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of water or of tears. We will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, "Disarm, disarm. The sword is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession." As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of counsel. Let them first meet as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each learning after his own time the sacred impress, not of Caesar, but of God. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient and at the earliest period consistent with its object, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, and the great and general interests of peace.
Thank you. So we're talking 156 years ago. Those words were spoken, written, shared, disseminated widely, still radical, still unfortunately relevant all these years later. This call for mothers to say enough, enough. And she called for that Mother's Day the second week in June, and it was celebrated for quite a while during that time, over a decade or more. And eventually, I guess, kind of petered out, and that Mother's Day that we know was created later. But this was the original Mother's Day. It's I always appreciate the Sunday as an opportunity for you use to reclaim this aspect of Mother's Day, because it made such a difference at the time. And the thing I like about Julia, too, is she wasn't some naive pacifist. She had been in the middle of the Civil War working with wounded soldiers. She'd been on the battlefields. She wrote the lyrics to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. This was not somebody who believed that injustice should just be allowed to stand. She knew that sometimes you have to take real action. But she also knew that the people who make decisions are often not the people who pay the price. She knew that it was the mothers, the fathers, the people back home, the regular folks who were paying the price for the decisions made by people at high levels of society. She felt that those who bore the consequences should be the ones who actually shape society. You know, over the last year or so, the current Pope, Pope Leo, has called for peace. I think it's something like over 400 times. He's made statements about peace. And we've seen the response from leadership here in the United States, calling that weak or ineffectual. No, I don't think they probably know that word, but weak. Too many syllables, right? But we've seen that response. And what peace actually offers us when we call for peace is hope. It's not weakness. It's hope, practical, concrete hope that we're being offered. But often throughout history, culture rewards outrage, domination, humiliation, and power. And the truth is that peace is power. It's not passive peace building. It actually requires diplomacy and creativity. It requires the hard work of actually caring and knowing about the consequences of decisions that are made. Peace building is powerful. Much more powerful than the things that often masquerade as power in our world today. And as I'm thinking about all this, I was thinking about those DOGE decisions that happened right at the beginning of the current administration, and that we're hearing more and more about that process that they went through. But talk about decisions that are made without really understanding the consequences on the ground for real people. Decisions based on language, just wanting to cut anything that talks about diversity, equity, or inclusion, or decisions based on some idea of efficiency where you haven't even consulted the people working in that field. Decisions that you don't feel when you're the person making them. At least you're not going to feel them in the moment. But people down the line, and maybe even you yourself, will eventually feel them in making those decisions. It's very easy for people who are outside of the situation to make decisions about how people will live and exist and go forward without really understanding the consequences. But we're looking at Julia Ward Howe today because she understood how dangerous systems become when they're disconnected from actual human lives, when we actually forget about the cost of decisions. That's why she was calling for peace. Not because she had some idealistic idea of the way the world can be, not because she was naive, but because she believed that when you stop moving toward a goal of peace, you lose humanity when you're doing that. This is true of anything, whether it's war or healthcare or poverty, gun violence. It's easy to make decisions in the abstract when you're not holding a grieving child, or when you're not exhausted as a caregiver, when you're not frightened, trying to protect your family. You know, the call for us, too, is to recognize that peace is not just about diplomacy and nations. It's also about something that we find within ourselves, which is not always easy at the moment. There's a lot out there that's designed for us to hate, to get caught in all of these complicated feelings out there, in the outrage, that constant stimulation that braces us for conflict. We're not really built to process and hold all of that. It's too much for our spirits. So one of the spiritual tasks of this moment is refusing to let outrage overtake us. But that's hard. That's hard when power wants us to be dehumanized. This is something we have to hold on to, our humanity, in times of turmoil. You know, I think as I think about Mother's Day, that mothering, as much as we honor mothers as we traditionally think of them, mothering is also greater than biology. Mothering is about anyone who nurtures, anyone who serves as a caregiver for others, anyone who protects the vulnerable, anyone who refuses to discard people. And the question then becomes, what would society look like if it was shaped more by the people who actually understand what it means to care, to nurture, to love? I invite all of us to let this Mother's Day be an opportunity to remind ourselves to insist that human life matters, that those who nurture life should be the ones who help shape the future, and that peace is the difficult choice to remain human when the world keeps tempting us not to be.